Okay, so we're going to ask in this episode, what was the error in the Greek Matthew which Symmachus attacked on behalf of the Ebionites around 200 AD? So 200 to 220 AD, he's in there. And we're going to ask specifically, could it be and is it likely that it was the virgin birth account being added as a corruption around the time of the early 200s? And then that also helps us identify when did this first happen, by the way. So this whole sequence shows you it wasn't originally there. Something happens in the early 200s, time of Symmachus, and Symmachus is asked by the Ebionites, come help us. And in thanks, he gets smeared as an Ebionite himself, but he's just simply a top-ranked scholar who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and he's coming to the defense of the Ebionites that they're right, that the words in Isaiah 7 are not about a virgin. They're about a young woman. That I think will be clear once we read Eusebius's statement of what was his role. Okay, and I'm not going to read everything of this, but this is Henry Wace, Dictionary of Christian Biography, London, 1911. You can find out more about Symmachus, but all I care about showing you is that a note was found in Origen's handwriting. Origen is a Christian commentator, Bible writer, Bible commentator on our scripture, and he wrote on a note that a young lady, Juliana, who had taken care of him and given him protection while the persecution was going on in his house, she handed him a book, and then Origen wrote a note in that book that was found when he died, and it said, Juliana gave me this book. Well, I'll tell you what it is, but basically he's going to basically say a book came from Symmachus, and that helps us date the time period of Symmachus's death. That's really all it really relates to. But in that note, he calls him the interpreter of the Jews. So I use that to say this. Origen is saying Symmachus was the interpreter of the Jews in his own handwriting in the around 230 period. So that tells you that Symmachus is not a Christian, and Origen doesn't think he's a Christian. So that is a myth that the Roman Catholic Church makes up to smear Symmachus and discount his evidence, his testimony, which was still in existence when Eusebius makes that smear in I'll call it 325 AD. Okay, so anyway, so finding out what his date of death is difficult. The other thing here is that Symmachus's Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible is so well known that Origen used it in what's called his HEXAPLA, where he takes all the he takes six other Bibles translations into Greek of the Hebrew Bible, and he puts them in columns so that you can compare the translations. And so, as you're studying the Bible, you can look at all the competing translations and see how the same words were translated in other editions. And Jerome himself praised Symmachus and said, I've used him to do translations from Greek, using his Greek translation to do my Latin Vulgate. So he's not a slouch. He's a very well-known person, very successful person in his profession as a professional translator from Hebrew to Greek. Now, Wace is the only source I could ever find that gave a very detailed piece of information about that note of Origen's. So it's in Origen's own handwriting, and so it's in Wace's book. And the full quote was, Origen handwrites, "This book I found in the house of Juliana, the Virgin in Caesarea, when I was hiding there, who said that she had received it from Symmachus himself, the interpreter of the Jews." So all we can derive from that is Origen is saying Symmachus has already passed on, and this book was from Symmachus, and he calls him the interpreter of the Jews. We can therefore infer Origen has no idea or interpretation that you would conclude Symmachus, or Juliana had concluded that Symmachus was a Christian or a Christian Ebionite. And that's, again, it was deliberately a smear affixed to him to undermine his credibility as a world-renowned expert on Hebrew when he says what he's going to say, obviously, about Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Was it a virgin or was it a young woman? Okay, now continuing with Wace's biography, and this is from his page. For reasons are completely mystifying me, he thinks Palladius, by his incidental statement, somehow is confirming Eusebius's conclusion in 325 AD that Symmachus is a Ebionite. I don't see that. I don't see any inference that could rise that way. Okay. Okay, so now that we have a background on who Symmachus is, and I think we've established he's a very reputable Hebrew scholar, recognized by Jerome to do excellent translation from Hebrew to Greek. Okay, that's key. And Jerome is the best we have, probably the only person who could give you a fair assessment of Symmachus. And anyway, so now we're going to go into the question: what was it that Symmachus came to defend the Ebionites over? Was it material, and what was the issue? Was it about the virgin birth account in the Greek version of Hebrew, Greek translation of the Hebrew Matthew? Did something happen that caused the Ebionites to ask for his assistance? Okay, so mentioned in Origen at one time, but we don't know what it is anymore. Okay, nobody's ever cited any proof of this, but was explained in Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastiae, which means History of the Church, Book 6, Chapter 17. As to these translators, it should be stated that Symmachus was an Ebionite. So there you go. He just says it as if it were fact. And again, he's trying to already impeach him, so that whatever he says we can just ignore, because he's part of the group he's defending. And again, we shouldn't accept anything as claims that are demonstrably untrue. Origen said, who was Symmachus? The interpreter of the Jews. He's Jewish. He's not Christian. So we should go by the contemporary handwritten note that Palladius found 100 years after Eusebius wrote, and that note confirms something that Mr. Wace didn't see, that Origen's handwritten note, quoted by Palladius in the 420 period, says he's what? He's the interpreter of the Jews. Therefore, this is contradictory to this statement by Eusebius. And so Symmachus is simply an interpreter of the Jews, and a Jewish man, therefore. Then he goes on, but the heresy of the Ebionites, as it is called, asserts that Christ was the son of Joseph and Mary, considering him a mere man. Okay, now Eusebius is writing right around 325, 330 AD, so he is talking 130 years after Symmachus has been engaged to help the Ebionites in whatever it is, and we're going to get to that in a second. He's going to talk about it. So the Ebionites assert that Christ was the son of Joseph and Mary, considering him a mere man. Nobody considers Jesus a mere man, but they considered him a man. So this is a form of being cynical and expressing cynicism as you're summarizing something, and that's all that's going on here. And insist strongly on keeping the law in a Jewish manner. Well, that's fair, because they're Jews. And the law is still obligated to them. Nothing Jesus did loosened the law from them. And insists, okay, and insists, these Ebionites, and insists strongly on keeping the law in a Jewish manner, as we've already seen in this history, meaning Eusebius' histories. Then he says this is important. Commentaries of Symmachus are still extant. In other words, there are commentaries, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, have all been destroyed. One of the most important translators of that time period, better than the other two guys, their commentaries may exist, but his are wiped out. Why? Because he's associated in history with the Ebionites, and he has to be destroyed. So we can't even reconstruct by looking at his commentaries, which should have survived, what they said. But they existed in the 325, 330 period. That's what Eusebius even says. Commentaries of Symmachus are still extant, in which he appears to support this heresy. What's the heresy? It's the virgin birth. By attacking the Gospel of Matthew, but it's obviously the Greek Gospel of Matthew, not the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, Origen states that he obtained these and other commentaries of Symmachus on the scriptures from a certain Juliana, who he says received the books by inheritance from Symmachus himself. Okay, so she gets it by Symmachus' passing away, and what may be implied here is that Origen had some documents that had survived by this time, but since then had been destroyed, that Eusebius is referring to, that would have told us what were on the pieces of paper that Juliana inherited from Symmachus, and would tell us precisely what was his response about the book of Matthew. What was it in the, particularly obviously the Greek Gospel of Matthew? There was a Greek translation of something inside the Hebrew Matthew, and it affected the virgin birth account, and that's what is the core issue, and Eusebius is putting his finger on it. So I'm going to show you in another slide how we can more clearly define what it is Eusebius is saying Symmachus says. Okay, so we're going to take this in a couple of steps, but what we're going to do is truncate down the language and just strip out and look at the material statements. So the first number 1 point is the Ebionites have a heresy of no virgin birth. As to these translators, it should be stated that Symmachus was an Ebionite. So they are acknowledging, or Eusebius acknowledges, the role of Symmachus is as a translator. But the heresy of the Ebionites, as it is called, asserts that Christ was the son of Joseph and Mary, considering him a mere man. So he is focusing in on the virgin. He mentions the virgin birth account. Now he doesn't say yet why that has anything to do with Symmachus. So we're going to have to figure it out from what he's going to say in the next sentence. So he's basically going to say in the next sentence that Symmachus, a translator, agrees the Greek Matthew has an error that supported the virgin birth thesis of the Ebionites. So he says this: the commentaries of Symmachus are still extant in which he appears to support this heresy of the Ebionites by attacking the obviously Greek Gospel of Matthew. And so calling him an Ebionite, though, does tell you that Eusebius is telling you that Symmachus is backing up the Ebionite position, but not because he's an Ebionite. I mean, that's what he wants you to think. It's only because he's an Ebionite. But that's not true. He is a scholar, an interpreter of the Jews, and he has come out in defense of the Ebionite position about something that was material to them, about the translation of some word in the Greek Gospel of Matthew that they believed was wrong. Now, what in the world could that be? I suggest it's obvious and transparent. It's Isaiah 7 verse 14, the same thing that's going on today, that somehow somebody, when they translated the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew into Greek, maybe there was a passage about Isaiah 7 verse 14 in there already, or it was being added by the Greek translator. We don't know which is which. But whatever it was, it's obvious reading if we read the Greek Matthew, and that's what we're reading. When we read English translation, we're reading a translation of the English Matthew, not the original Hebrew that existed in Caesarea all the way up to 390 and was translated by Jerome, and he made a Latin and a Hebrew translation. But because of the purge of everything having to do with the Ebionites, it's completely been lost to history. Obviously, it was destroyed, particularly obviously during Theodosius' regime, where anything and everything dealing with the Ebionites had to be wiped out, as if they never existed. And so their memory would be blotted out in history. That's what was the intention of the Roman Catholic Church about our original church, that we would never know who they were. We would never hear of them again. They would be anathema because they don't agree with the virgin birth account. Okay, anyway, just leave it there. So now, let's see what the next slide is. Okay, so what we're going to deduce here is that, in conclusion, is that this boils down to Eusebius is actually saying that Symmachus is the translator. He was an Ebionite, so that tells you he's going to defend the Ebionites, but we know that independently that he's not actually a member of the Ebionites. He's just helping them. And he's a professional, and he makes money at it. He translates Bibles and sells them, and he sells commentaries. So he's an independent person, you know, of some means, obviously, by selling his books and making translations and so on. But he's doing it for the Jewish people, not for Christians. But he's helping the Ebionites in this. And it says in his commentaries, obviously for the Jewish people, on what? supposedly, or what Eusebius is saying is he's defending some issue on the virgin birth account to help the Ebionites dispute that account. And so obviously he's looking at Isaiah 7, verse 14. He's defending the position, according to Eusebius, of them about something in the Bible. It's obviously the issue of, is Alma, does it mean virgin or does it mean young woman? We showed you in a video just recently from the Jewish Bible Quarterly, 2013. It's unequivocal, no dispute. The only meaning of this word is young woman. We Christians can come up with all the lexicographies we want among Christians. You know, we can try to redefine for the Hebrew people. We know your Bible has another meaning to the word Alma, and we think it's virgin. And so we don't care about your own definitions, as if they have no right. But the article yesterday from the Jewish Quarterly, Bible Quarterly, shows that it's on lexicographer grounds alone, you would conclude it's young woman, and you would not infer it means virgin, particularly when you have another word called Betula, which it has only a meaning of virgin, and young woman only has a meaning of young woman. And in context also, she's pregnant and she's about to have child. That's what it actually says in Isaiah 7:14. So you wouldn't use a passage like that to even try to argue that it meant something about a virgin. That was not what was making it special. She was a young woman who's pregnant, who's about to have a child, and she will name her son Emmanuel. And so next point was commentaries of Symmachus are still extant, which he appears to support this heresy of the virgin birth, against the virgin birth, by attacking the obviously Greek Gospel of Matthew. So now we've reconstructed what was going on, and we can trust that Symmachus was giving us a legitimate expert opinion, and we can also understand that our church, our original church, the church of the Ebion, was the church of the 12. James. Now they're all dead by the 200, so they're not there anymore. But these are their successors, and we know their exact names and their further brother. I think they're further brothers, and then there's an uncle of other family members of Jesus are in the succession later. The next two bishops, Jude, and there's Cleopas, I think. They were both in there. So I don't know who the bishop would have been in 200, but whoever it is, it's of our original church. And so these are the people who have the repository of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, which they keep at Caesarea in a special library, and they allow people to go in there and make copies as they wish. And that continued all the way up to 390s when Jerome goes in there and himself makes a copy and makes a Hebrew. He translates it from the Hebrew to Latin and to Greek. And because of the purge of everything Ebion, those two translations have been lost to history, as well as the Hebrew Matthew was destroyed, obviously, by the Roman Catholic Church, because this gospel doesn't have a virgin birth account. Just that alone was enough for them to destroy everything, and all the work that Jerome had done has to be thrown in the trash heap, because it has something we can't tolerate. We can't have there be any memory of there ever being a passage that said Joseph begat Jesus. We're destroying all of them. Yet, they didn't destroy all the copies, as we showed you. The Sinai Sinaiticus has Joseph begat Jesus from 340, and it's the oldest Bible. Do you know that? The oldest Bible we ever found has the words Joseph begat Jesus. It's found, it's called the Sinai Sinaiticus, and it's been 2 letters of Justin from 200 AD, and another, the author is unknown, but it's Aquila and Tacos, I can't remember. And that also has Joseph begat Jesus as the verse. So the evidence is overwhelming that was the original way it looked, and the church has done everything to purge and destroy everything that was ever had any evidence of anything different, including the commentaries of Symmachus, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and the translations by Jerome of the Hebrew Matthew into both Latin and Greek. So if you ask me, it's one of the greatest literary crimes that have ever been committed by anyone, and was committed by the Roman Catholic Church to defend and protect the virgin birth account, which they should have known it destroys Jesus' messiahship, because Joseph is not any longer his father, and it left Matthew with Jeconiah as in the line of even Joseph as the way to Jesus becoming the Messiah. And of course he can't be Messiah because Jeconiah is blocked from that possibility. Nobody in his line can ever become king of Israel. So Many reasons why they should have woken up, and they didn't. But we have to wake up ourselves, and we have to fix this. It's now up to our generation, and we have been given what is our greatest weapon? The Dead Sea Scrolls found the Ebion writings about the conflict between James and Paul. Paul is called the spouter of lies. James the just is called the teacher of righteousness, or actually the Zaddiq, Zaddick, and he, or Zaddik, and he is the leader of the group. It's a new covenant community. The Messiah has been killed by the priests in the towns, and the new covenant community is waiting for the Messiah to come back. And the spouter of lies contends the Habakkuk 2 verse 4 means you're saved by faith, and the Habakkuk Pesher by the Zaddiq says no, it's salvation by obedience and faithfulness. That's what the word eminah means. I mean, it's unequivocal, but suppressed. That this is the original church. Oh, you know what? I have something I want to show you. The Encyclopedia Britannica summary of who the Ebionites are in light of the discoveries. What are they going to say in light of the discoveries that we now know the Ebion writings are in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Let's take a look at that real quick. Okay, so before I sign off, I want us to see how the Encyclopedia Britannica deals with Ebionites in its summary of who they are. This is in their 2007 to 2022 edition, September, and is identical, never changed, electronic version. And so they are going along with a view of the Ebionites that is false and misleading. So let's go look at it. The Ebionite movement may have arisen about the time of the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, AD 70. Now that's false, and we know that for multiple reasons. One, Jerome says when Paul is writing his epistle to the Galatians and says he's making he intends to do help and remember the poor of Jerusalem. Jerome pipes in his commentary in Galatians, and he says he's evidently referring to the Ebion of Jerusalem, the group known as the poor. And so that means that it existed as early as Galatians, which is 47 AD, the name, and it was in use. And that's what Jerome could recognize. It then says most of the features of the Ebionite doctrine were anticipated in the teachings of an earlier Qumran sect. We'll get into that in a second, as revealed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so what do we know now about his history since well before 2007? How this is escaping experts, I don't know. There was no Qumran sect, okay? There was a small fort manned by a few people. It was actually abandoned before 70 AD, apparently, and there was no community there. There was a clay plate factory, and there was about 30 to 50 plates there, and the was mistaken to the plates were mistaken to indicate that there was some sort of community that operated there. There was no community that operated there at the time the scrolls were put there, and instead the scrolls were literally secreted from Jerusalem down to this area of Qumran, and the coins in the caves showed that there were coins as recent as 67 AD. So we're talking about people to protect the scrolls, took them down out of Jerusalem, brought them to the caves, put them in Qumran, sealed them, hoped that they would survive themselves the siege of Jerusalem when they went back. They didn't. They all got killed. They didn't come back. They didn't take the scrolls back out. So that tells you how devastating was the 1.5 million people that died in that temple siege by Rome. And all these people gave up their lives and they went back to protect the city. So none of them survived and none of them came back to get the stuff. Anyway, then the summary by the Encyclopedia Britannica continues. They believed in one God and taught that Jesus was the Messiah and was the true prophet, mentioned in Deuteronomy 18 verse 15. They should have mentioned, just as Apostle Peter said the same thing in Acts 3 verse 21 through 23, where he says that Jesus was the prophet of Deuteronomy 18 verse, and he quotes Deuteronomy 18, 15 to 18. It seems that most Christians don't believe or know that Jesus was the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, and they don't know what it means. And it's a very important significance. It was at the center of Christ being Messiah that he was also the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. And we have videos on that too, but it's like these people know stuff that we don't pay any attention to and don't even know about. And so I believe the Britannica probably didn't know that Jesus is the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. Anyway, finishes up here. It says, they rejected the virgin birth of Jesus, instead holding that he was the natural son of Joseph and Mary. The Ebionites believed Jesus became the Messiah because he obeyed the Jewish law. Well, that's not true. They believed he became the Messiah because he was born of the son of Joseph, and he then fulfilled the prophecies of the Messiah, which there are numerous ones, but that's not what we're here. We've got the prophecy of Genesis 49:10, the blood of grapes all over his clothes, and we've got the prophecy of Zechariah. We got the prophecy of Isaiah 53. We have the prophecy of Habakkuk, and all these prophecies, they all involve Jesus in them. So anyway, that's not why they believed he was Messiah. They believed for a lot more than just being a good guy. So anyway, but when you want to slight and insult people, you minimize them and you don't depict them as properly as you should. Anyway, so the Ebionites are still not recognized yet for their role in the Ebionite records at the Dead Sea, which means any of the records that refer to the poor are records they did. And so that means they did the Damascus document, they did the Habakkuk Pesher, they did the two works, the justification by works books, they did the, what was the other one? I can't remember the other one, but there's more scrolls. So these scrolls depict the battle between the spouter of lies and the person called the Zadik or righteous one, and Eisenman makes a very solid case in several books that this is a conflict between Paul and James the Just. And we need to back him up, speak out, and say, hey, you guys have to confront this, British Encyclopedia Britannica. Why are you not including any mention of this? Because that evidence seems very solid. Don't you think so? What don't you agree with? The Habakkuk Pesher, the spouter of lies, thinks Habakkuk 2 verse 4 means you're saved without works of the law, by faith alone. Doesn't that sound like the conflict between Paul, who cites that verse twice for that very proposition, versus James in his epistle, who cites the opposite? Don't you think that's important? And so things like that, we need to confront them and say, hey, we need to change. We need you to fix your encyclopedia entry and say these people believed in the word James, even just summarize, just say Professor Eisenman says this is the poor are reflected clearly in the reference to the conflict between James and Paul in these four works, and at least do that. So we need to start getting the narrative improved here. It's very poor at the moment. All right, God bless. Hope this helps everybody. Ciao. Bye.